The flute stops. That's the first thing you need to understand, not the drum, not the war cry, a flute. In the dead of winter, on the open plains of what is now the Dakotas, a young man stands outside a teepee in the dark, playing a song he made up himself. Nobody taught him this melody. He composed it alone in secret, for exactly one person on earth, and the moment she hears it, she'll know who's outside. She'll know why he's there. And she'll know that half the camp is listening, waiting to see what she does next. This wasn't romance the way Europe understood it. This was strategy, public, coded, dangerous in its own quiet way, because getting it wrong could cost a man his reputation for life. When French and later American settlers first encountered Lakota, Dakota and Nakota courtship, they didn't know what they were looking at. They saw young men standing motionless outside lodges for hours. They saw elaborate blankets used like walls. They saw gifts, sometimes entire herds of horses, handed over before a single word of affection was spoken, and they assumed, the way outsiders always do, that they understood. They didn't. What they were watching was one of the most intricate social systems on the continent, a system built not on spontaneous emotion, but on discipline, family alliance, and public performance. A system where a woman held more control over her own fate than most European women of the same century. A system where courtship wasn't private, it was theater, and everyone was watching. This is the story of how the Sioux fell in love, and why almost no one outside the tribe understood the rules of the game. Let's start with the thing that confused outsiders the most: the blanket. Among the Lakota, there was a courting practice sometimes called the blanket ceremony. A young man wrapped in a large blanket or robe would approach a young woman, often near a stream where women gathered water, or outside her family's lodge in the evening, and pull the blanket around both of them. For a few minutes, sometimes longer, the two of them stood together inside that shared covering, faces close, voices low. To a 19th century missionary watching from a distance, this looked scandalous, intimate, almost indecent. It wasn't. The blanket wasn't privacy. It was the opposite. It was a public announcement wrapped in the appearance of privacy, a socially sanctioned space where a couple could speak without the entire camp overhearing every word, but where everyone could see exactly what was happening. Mothers watched from doorways, brothers watched from a distance, some of them not so subtly positioned to intervene if a man overstayed his welcome. The blanket gave two young people a few stolen minutes of conversation. It did not give them freedom from scrutiny, and that's the part almost every outsider missed, because the real courtship wasn't happening in that blanket at all. It was happening somewhere else entirely, in the choices a young man made weeks, sometimes months, before he ever stood outside that lodge. Here's the first curiosity worth sitting with. Among the Sioux, a man's ability to court a woman had almost nothing to do with what he said to her. It had to do with what he had already done. War honors, hunting skill, generosity toward the poor and the elderly in camp, a reputation for keeping his word. These weren't side notes to courtship. They were the entire foundation of it. A young man with no war honors, no hunting record, nothing to show for himself, had almost no standing to court a woman from a respected family. Not because love was forbidden to him, because reputation was the currency, and he simply didn't have any. This is where the story gets uncomfortable for anyone raised on the idea that romance should be spontaneous, private, and free of calculation. Because Sioux courtship was calculated, deliberately so. A young man who wanted to marry well understood that he was not just presenting himself to a woman. He was presenting himself to her entire family, her father, her mother, her brothers, sometimes an extended network of relatives whose opinion could make or break the match. Winning the woman's interest was only step one. Winning the family's approval was the real contest, and the family did not approve quietly. This is where the gifts come in, and this is the part that truly stunned early European observers, because on the surface it looked like something they already had a word for: purchase. Among many plains tribes, including the Sioux, a suitor's family would present gifts to the woman's family: horses, robes, weapons, sometimes an accumulation of wealth built over years specifically for this purpose. Traders and missionaries recorded this with barely concealed horror, calling it wife-buying, assuming they were watching something transactional and cold, a woman handed over like livestock. They had the mechanics right and the meaning completely wrong. The gifts weren't payment for a person. They were a public demonstration of the suitor's family's ability to provide, proof that if their son married into this family, the woman would never go hungry, never lack for horses, never be without protection. It was less a purchase than a promise, made visible in the most tangible currency the plains had: horses, the measure of wealth and mobility itself. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions: the woman's family could refuse the gifts. If they did, the courtship ended. No marriage, no argument, no negotiation. A rejected gift was a rejected suitor. The woman's family held the veto power in nearly every account we have, a level of female family authority that would have seemed almost unthinkable to a European bride whose marriage was arranged by her father alone, often without her having ever exchanged a word with the man she'd marry. The Sioux woman, by contrast, frequently had a voice her European counterpart didn't. Which brings us to something even stranger to outside eyes. Sometimes she said no, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, because for all the family politics, all the gift-giving, all the choreography of reputation and honor, the final decision, in most documented cases, belonged to the woman herself. A suitor could have the finest war record in the band. He could bring 20 horses to her father's door, and she could still refuse him, outright, publicly, and custom offered her that right. This is the part that unsettled colonial observers the most, because it broke the story they'd already written in their heads. They expected to find a primitive society where women were traded like property between men. Instead, they found something closer to a courtship economy with real consumer choice, where a woman's reputation for virtue, skill, and family standing gave her leverage, and where her refusal wasn't just tolerated, it was final. There's a particular practice that captures this perfectly: the flute. We started with it. Let's go back. Among the Lakota, a young man who could not compose or play his own courting song was, in a real sense, unprepared to court at all. The flute, the siotanka, sometimes called the elk or courting flute, wasn't decoration. It was identity. Each man's melody was understood to be personally his, recognizable to the woman. It was meant for the way a signature is recognizable on a page. Legend held that the flute's music itself carried a kind of magnetic power, an ability to draw a woman's attention even against her better judgment, which tells you something important about how seriously this culture took the emotional and even supernatural weight of courtship. This wasn't casual. It wasn't a light-hearted serenade. It was believed to touch something real. And here's the twist that turns this from folklore into strategy. A young man might spend hours near a woman's lodge, playing the same phrase over and over into the cold night air, not because he expected an answer that night, but because repetition, patience, and public visibility were themselves the point. The whole camp would come to know over weeks exactly who was courting whom. There was no ambiguity, no mixed signals, no wondering if the interest was real. Everyone knew. That was intentional, because in a small, tightly interdependent camp, where every marriage affected alliances, resources, and the social fabric that kept people alive through brutal winters, ambiguity was a luxury nobody could afford. But it's a mistake to think this was purely about calculation and family strategy. There was real tenderness inside this structure, and real risk for the people inside it. Consider what it meant to be a young woman inside this system. Her reputation, often referred to in terms tied to chastity and modesty, was central to her family's honor and to her own marriage prospects. Many accounts describe strict social codes around a young unmarried woman's conduct, including expectations of chaperoning and limits on unsupervised time with suitors. Violating those codes could damage not just her standing, but her family's. At the same time, women were not passive figures waiting in lodges for a flute to play. Sioux women managed enormous economic responsibility, processing hides, managing lodges, raising children, contributing directly to the survival of the band. Many chroniclers, both native and non-native, describe them as shrewd judges of a man's character because they had to be. Marrying poorly wasn't a romantic disappointment, it was a survival risk. So when a woman refused a suitor, she wasn't being coy. She was making a calculated judgment about her own future, backed by direct observation of a man's honor, skill, and reliability. Judgments she was often better positioned to make than any outsider assumed. This is the part that never made it into settler journals. The woman wasn't the prize in this system. She was one of its sharpest evaluators. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn, because courtship, for all its ritual, could fail in ways that put both people at real risk. Elopement existed. When a couple wanted to marry against family wishes, because the families disapproved, or because there hadn't been time for the customary exchange of gifts. Some couples simply left camp together, returning later as a married pair, forcing the families to accept a match already made. This was a genuine act of defiance, understood as such by everyone in camp, and it could carry real social cost, strained relationships, damaged reputations, sometimes lasting friction between families who felt bypassed. And then there was the darkest thread in the record: abduction. Historical and ethnographic accounts describe rare instances where a rejected or impatient suitor took a woman by force rather than accept her refusal, a violation of the courtship code so severe it could provoke violent retaliation from her family and band. This wasn't celebrated or normalized within the culture. It was recognized as a crime against both the woman and the social order, and accounts describe swift, sometimes lethal consequences for men who attempted it. That detail matters because it destroys the lazy assumption some outsiders carried, that because courtship rules didn't match European ones, women had no real protection. The opposite was closer to the truth. The elaborate, public, family-anchored structure of Sioux Courtship existed precisely because it created accountability. Everyone in camp knew who was courting whom, who had been refused, whose honor was on the line. That visibility was itself a form of protection, one that a private, individualized courtship system, ironically, often lacked. So why did the settlers get it so wrong? Partly because they were looking for a mirror. European courtship in the 1800s was steeped in ideas of romantic secrecy, private letters, family arrangement conducted quietly behind closed doors, and a bride's consent that was often more formality than actual power. When settlers saw horses exchanged, they reached instinctively for their own closest concept: purchase. When they saw a blanket wrapped around two young people, they reached for scandal. When they saw a young woman calmly refuse a decorated warrior, they often didn't record it at all just because it didn't fit the story they expected to find. They weren't just misunderstanding a custom. They were misunderstanding an entire logic of relationships, one built around transparency instead of privacy, family alliance instead of individual romance, and a woman's public leverage instead of quiet, invisible influence. And this is where the bigger question starts to surface. Which system actually gave people more real say over their own lives? Think about what Sioux Courtship actually protected against: ambiguity, secrecy, isolation. Her suitor couldn't hide his intentions. The whole camp watched him play his flute night after night. A woman couldn't be pressured in private. Her family stood between her and any man who might try. And a rejection wasn't a private heartbreak absorbed alone. It was witnessed, understood, and respected by an entire community. Compare that to the courtship customs many 19th century settlers brought with them. Private, often financially motivated arrangements where a young woman's preferences could be quietly overridden by a father eager to settle a favorable match with no public witness to hold anyone accountable. It's worth sitting with that contrast for a moment, because it flips the assumption almost every outside observer carried into these encounters, that indigenous customs were the primitive ones and European customs were the civilized ones. The record doesn't support that hierarchy nearly as cleanly as those observers believed. What we're really looking at, when we strip away the horses and the blankets and the flutes, is a society that understood something modern relationships often forget: that love, left completely unwitnessed, is fragile. That accountability isn't the enemy of intimacy. It can be its foundation. That a woman's no means nothing if there's no community structure willing to enforce it. The Sioux built that structure, publicly, deliberately, generation after generation, before any European ship reached this coastline. And when settlers finally saw it, the flute in the dark, the blanket by the doorway, the horses led to a father's lodge, they mistook a system of protection for a spectacle of primitiveness. They weren't watching people who loved less carefully than they did. They were watching people who had simply decided that love, like survival itself on the open plains, was too important to leave unwitnessed. If you'd like, I can also draft a shorter, punchier YouTube-optimized version with timestamp section markers for editing, or write a second episode script covering a different tribe or theme in the same series.